A lot of the discussion you'll hear about identity politics focuses on how immoral and destructive it is, and for good reason. Judging people on the basis of characteristics they can't control is wrong. Decent people understand that, but a lesser-known side effect of identity politics is that it leaves the people who believe in it, the daytime anchors of MSNBC, for example, completely bewildered by major political events. Identity politics makes its adherents significantly dumber, basically. There's no other way to put it. That's what it does. So take the election of Donald Trump in 2016, for example. This was 8 years ago, and by now, most of us have a pretty good idea why it happened. Trump, unlike Hillary Clinton, did not tell coal miners that he was going to put them out of business. He didn't describe half the country as deplorable or extol the virtues of free trade in towns where all the good jobs have moved overseas. Instead, Trump's message, not his skin color, his gender, any other aspect of his identity, resonated with tens of millions of Americans. Whether you disagree with his message or you agree with it, that's just it. It should be obvious. But somehow it's not obvious to MSNBC. As of this week, in the year 2024, they're still very much unsure why Donald Trump won in 2016 and why he's leading in every major presidential poll today. Watch.
And as we barrel toward a likely rematch of the 2020 election, one candidate continues to have a hold over white rural voters. But it's not Joe Biden, seen here as a boy on the right side of your screen who went to public school, is the son of a used car salesman, and was born to a middle-class family in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Instead, it is Trump here on the left side, a private school educated son of a New York City real estate tycoon who became a millionaire at 8 years old and didn't have to serve because he claimed he had bone spurs in his little feet. So why is it that Trump appeals so much to a group he couldn't be more different from?
I do like when they show the childhood photos because it looks like they were both taken in like the Civil War era. Which I don't think is what they meant to highlight, but they did. Anyway, the premise of this intro is that by default, you'd expect Joe Biden to be dominating the vote among white rural voters because unlike Donald Trump, Joe Biden's dad was a used car salesman and his family was middle class growing up. This is how MSNBC anchors and their viewers see the world. They vote on the basis of identity, that is, characteristics the candidates can't control. And because the essence of modern liberalism is projection, they think that everyone else must vote the same way too. Or that they should anyway. It doesn't matter to them that Biden devoted his entire professional life to representing the interests of banks and credit card issuers in the Senate to the point that a bank hired Biden's son, just as Biden was pushing major legislation that would benefit that same bank. They don't care that Biden somehow owns multiple mansions, despite the fact that he's supposedly been earning a politician's salary his whole life. They don't even care about anything that Trump campaigned on or delivered in office. All they can process is the respective identities of the two candidates, which were determined at birth. Now, the problem with this level of ignorance is that a critical mass of Americans now subscribe to it. So at this point, one of two options is possible. Either the left can renounce identity politics and they can start debating ideas, or they can double down on identity politics, which inevitably means declaring war against the identities that they see as the enemy. Now, as this MSNBC segment went on, it became very clear which option they're obviously going to choose. Mika Brzezinski introduces two authors who just wrote a book entitled White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. And I want you to watch as the authors describe the supposed threat that these dastardly voters pose to America. Watch.
Joining us now, Professor of Political Science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Tom Schaller, and journalist and opinion writer Paul Waldman. Their new book, out tomorrow, is entitled White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. And Tom, we'll start with you. Why are white rural voters a threat to democracy at this point? You would think, as we pointed out, looking at Joe Biden's background and Donald Trump's, that the opposite would be true.
I mean, we lay out the fourfold interconnected threat that white rural voters pose to the country. First of all, and we show 30 polls and national studies to demonstrate this, so we provide the receipts in Chapter 6. They're the most racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and anti-gay geodemographic group in the country. Second, they're the most conspiracist group. QAnon support and subscribers, election denialism, COVID denialism and scientific skepticism, Obama birtherism.
Yeah, why not? I mean, you want to demonize an entire group of people. So the two guys you should bring in are two guys who have never, even driven through the country. These guys have never even seen a cow in their lives. and they're the ones that are going to bring in to be the experts on white rural voters, and we'll even leave aside the whole idea that a group of voters could be a threat to democracy simply by participating in it. But be that as it may, and we'll play the rest of the answer in a second. But we need to stop to make a few points. And first is this: that it needs to be said that when they use the term white rural voter, they really just mean, of course, white poor voter. Now, throughout the book, these white rural voters are described as being beleaguered, having stagnant incomes, having high rates of poverty, unemployment, and homelessness. They just as easily could have titled their book White Poor Rage if they wanted to. That's pretty obvious, of course, but it's notable that they still feel the need to cloak their elitism in this little bit of euphemism. Presumably, they realize that if they start complaining about the behavior of poor white people, then it'd be pretty easy to point to the behavior of poor black people in this country, which doesn't compare particularly well by any objective metric, including most notably rates of violent crime. In fact, both poor black males and wealthy black males have a greater chance of committing a felony in their lifetimes than white males of any income level, which is a very interesting statistic. But these are the kinds of comparisons you can avoid when you use euphemisms like poor, or rather white rural Americans instead of poor white Americans. You also have some plausible deniability when people accuse you of just being, an elitist snob who finds lower income people repugnant, which is obviously the case here. But they can deny it because it's not lower income people they're mad at after all. It's just those pesky rural whites that they don't like. Well, let's put the euphemism aside for a second and get into the substance of what you just heard. According to the author of this book, which is really more like an anti-white screed, quote, we show 30 polls and national studies and we provide the receipts in chapter 6. Now, supposedly these receipts, call them receipts because everybody talks like they're posting on Twitter now, clearly demonstrate that white rural voters are a threat to the country, he says. And for example, according to the writers, quote, they're the most conspiracist group, QAnon supporters and subscribers, and COVID denialism. Well, that sounds pretty bad. COVID denialism. But what exactly is QAnon support and COVID denialism? Those terms are never defined in that interview. So I got a copy of the book and I looked through it, as painful as that was. And somewhere in chapter 6, I found this, quote, 85% of QAnon believers say the COVID-19 virus was human-made in a foreign lab. And QAnon believers are 1.5 times more likely to live in rural than in urban areas. So did you catch that? In other words, these white poor voters are supposedly nuts because they believe in the crazy QAnon theory that COVID was made in a foreign lab. In case you're keeping track at home, this happens to be the same unhinged QAnon conspiracy theory that the FBI director has publicly stated is likely to be true. More importantly, it's the same theory that any reasonable person would concede and has conceded all along is very plausible at a minimum. We've all listened to as the virologists on Tony Fauci's payroll change their stories about the origins of COVID. We've seen the warnings before the pandemic about the lax security at the Wuhan lab. We followed the funding going from the NIH to Wuhan for gain-of-function experiments. We've all noticed that the outbreak began practically down the street from the Wuhan lab. In fact, these white rural Americans apparently noticed that very early on. They noticed it before people like this noticed it. But noticing these facts does not make you a threat to democracy, despite what they may say, even if you happen to be white or poor or you live out in the country. And you get a sense that the authors of this book know that because in this interview, they're very careful to avoid specifying the details of the conspiracy theories that they're complaining about. Instead, they just call it COVID denialism, and then they just hope you won't check. Along the same lines, the authors claim that it's a lunatic conspiracy theory to suggest that global elites are pedophiles who participate in a sex trafficking operation, which, I guess would seem crazy if you haven't heard the name Jeffrey Epstein at any point in the past decade. And of course, as you've probably guessed, there's also the implication in this book that anyone who believes that the 2020 election wasn't completely on the up and up, anybody who has any issue with mail-in ballots or ballot harvesting or Biden getting 10 million more votes than Barack Obama by campaigning from his basement, must be lunatics. These are the conspiracy theories and the threats to democracy that these authors are referencing in this segment. We're in the midst of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. Many Christians are choosing to give up alcohol, social media, and other distractions to focus more on prayer, fasting, and giving. Hallow's annual Pray 40 Challenge is one of their most popular. Last year, over 1 million people joined. This year's Pray 40 Challenge focuses on surrender and includes meditations on the powerful book, He Leadeth Me. This is a story about a priest who became a prisoner and slave in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. His story is one of ultimate surrender, and we're called to offer up our worries, anxieties, problems, and lives to God. There'll also be Lent music, Lent-specific Bible stories, and other Lenten prayers like the 7 Last Words of Christ with Jim Caviezel. Hallow is truly transformative and will help you connect with your faith on a deeper level. So what are you waiting for? Join Hallow's Prayer 40 Challenge today. Download the Hallow app at hallow.com/Matt Walsh. That's hallow.com/Matt Walsh for an exclusive 3-month free trial of all 6,000 prayers and meditations. And as unbelievable as all this is, it gets worse somehow. I interrupted rudely this guy's answer in the MSNBC interview, so let's hear the rest of it.
Third, anti-democratic sentiments. They don't believe in an independent press, free speech. They're most likely to say the president should be able to act unilaterally without any checks from Congress or the courts or the bureaucracy. They're also the most strongly white nationalist and white Christian nationalists. And fourth, they are most likely to excuse or justify violence as an acceptable alternative to peaceful public discourse.
So you mentioned a lot of negative factors about this demographic.
Yeah, he can barely contain himself. He's practically frothing at the mouth to accuse poor white people of doing exactly what the Democratic Party has been doing for the last several years. It's kind of astonishing to watch. He claims that it's poor white voters who are the enemies of the freedom of speech, as if every power center in the Biden administration hasn't united to destroy Elon Musk for committing the crime of allowing people to talk on the internet, as if every major university in this country won't punish students for stating out loud that they believe in, things like biological reality, as if affirming the basic truth that all lives matter won't get you fired from every major corporation on the planet right now. No, it's the poor white voters who are at war with the independent press and the freedom of speech, we're told. That's what MSNBC would have you believe anyway. And the fact they can say with a straight face is the most revealing part. That's how committed they are to this fantasy. The whole answer you just saw was one absurdity after another. It's poor white voters, we're told, who supposedly want the president to act unilaterally and without any checks from Congress or, from the all-important unelected bureaucracy in Washington, according to these authors. And again, that might be a compelling argument if you were not alive to see Barack Obama in the Rose Garden announcing a unilateral amnesty for millions of illegal aliens in an election year. It might be a compelling argument if you were literally born yesterday and therefore didn't notice when Biden decided to ignore the Supreme Court and nationalize this country's rental properties and forgive, quote unquote, billions of dollars in student loan debt, which is to offload it to taxpayers. And in fact, to brag about the fact that he's doing it on his own without any permission from anyone, to brag about it frequently, including as recently as a week ago. It might be a compelling argument if you somehow missed the bombs that every administration in modern history has dropped without bothering to consult with Congress, much less seek their approval. So they're lying to your face again and again, and they're doing it for a reason. It's the same reason that the authors claim it's poor white people who excuse or justify violence as alternatives to peaceful public discourse. And to believe this, you would have had to miss the torching of churches and police stations and small businesses during the George Floyd riots. You'd have to ignore the fact that as people were being murdered in the name of civil rights, Kamala Harris was raising bail money for violent thugs. You have to focus entirely on January 6th as the singular act of so-called political violence, quote unquote, in the past decade, even though it's the one act of, quote, political violence in which only one person was killed, and it was a protester. You would have to subscribe without reservation to an alternate reality, all in the name of demonizing white, poor, predominantly Christian voters who don't want to support Joe Biden. Joe Biden, that humble child born into a middle-class family who turned out to be as corrupt a politician as the state of Delaware has ever seen, which, if you know Delaware, is really saying something. Now, there's one more clip from this interview that I want to show you because it underscores how little these people care about poor white people, even though they're, even when they're dying by the tens of thousands. So watch this. Here it is.
Reverend Al, guys, has a question for you. Rev?
Tom, wouldn't you also say that it is in the interest of those like Donald Trump to put the blame on people who are likely to be going through the same kinds of challenges in maybe a different part of the country, like blacks, like browns, like migrants. And he channels this rage that they rightfully have in rural areas toward the wrong people, and those that could do something about it escape without having to make change, because if those rural whites and blacks and migrants and browns came together, they could really force real change. Isn't it a diversion to the wrong people based on their inherent racism and xenophobia?
Absolutely, Rev Al, and as you probably know, 24% of rural America is non-white now. And we have had 8 years since Trump came down the escalator in June 2015 of focusing on rural whites, the heartland flyover people, and what their economic anxieties are. But with the exception of two things that we can find, opioid deaths and gun deaths, on every other measure in rural America, rural Latinos, rural African Americans, and rural Native Americans, the most rural population in America, are doing worse. And nobody cares about their economic anxieties.
I know it's not really the point, but I did enjoy Al Sharpton referring to blacks and browns. You know, you don't hear that very often. Yeah, you got the blacks, the browns. Apparently you can say that now. You can, okay, fine. But it's really an incredible statement there. It basically amounts to this. If you discount the fact that poor white people are killing themselves far more often than any other demographic group, and if you ignore the fact that they're overdosing on fentanyl far more than any other demographic group, basically if you ignore the two leading causes of death among young people, then poor white people have it pretty good. That's basically what he just said. This is the level of visceral disdain that the corporate press and the mainstream left has for white Americans. The point of going through all this is not to just rip apart the dumb arguments in some stupid book. The point is to ask, why exactly do the authors go to these lengths to lie about a very specific racial demographic? And why did one of the biggest media conglomerates on the planet decide to promote their lies and their overt racial disdain? And the truth is that, in spite of the euphemisms about rural whites that these authors use, they're actually being very direct in their dehumanization and villainization of a class that they see as undesirable. Now, corporate media has always hated poor whites, of course, but now they're almost coming out and saying it. This is as close to just coming out and saying it as we've seen. This MSNBC segment is as clear a declaration as we've ever seen, clearer even than Barack Obama's demonization of Pennsylvania voters clinging to guns and religion, clearer than Hillary Clinton's complaints about deplorables, that the left now stands for the unabashed hatred of poor white Americans, who already have been stripped of status, who have been discriminated against at every turn, who've lost their economic security at the altar of globalization. But it's still not enough. Still not enough demoralization, I guess. And you know that's why they see it, because no publisher would ever sell a book titled Black Ghetto Rage or something similar. Like, that book could not exist. There would be no shelf that it could sit on. Instead of addressing that topic, they're more likely to excuse black crime and violence as a symptom of late-stage capitalism. In fact, that's precisely what the Washington Post just did. Around the same time this segment is airing, they published this image of the CVS in Columbia Heights of Washington, D.C. And here's how the story begins in the Washington Post. It says, quote, "There's almost nothing left to steal at the CVS in Columbia Heights, and that gives you an idea of which items have actual value. Blank CDs, for example, the thieves don't even bother with them. The greeting card section has been left alone. Everything else that remains in the store in Northwest D.C., which is not much, is under plexiglass. It's been like this since at least October, when the legend of the empty CVS of Washington began to spread beyond the district's borders. It became a horror story of late capitalism." Okay, so when poor white people point out that COVID came from a lab, they're the enemies of democracy. When poor black people steal so much from a local CVS that toothpaste has to go behind plexiglass, then the issue is late capitalism. Now, obviously, where this all leads is racial resentment and ultimately racial violence. And for all their projection, that's what they want. They're not really afraid of poor white voters. That's not what they're afraid of. They're afraid that in less than a year, for the first time in several years, somebody in power might actually care what all these poor white people have to say. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.